In the last section, we covered two overarching frameworks for studying gender. The predominant way that people understand gender in everyday life is through the natural differences schema, which understands gender difference as primarily stemming from biological difference, and this theory relies on the gender binary. The social constructionist perspective argues that yes, biology matters, but that gender can only fully be understood in relation to the historical time period and culture in which we live. When we talk about sex versus gender, even people who are not strict biological determinists may concede that yes, gender is context dependent and is the result of some combination of biology, socialization, gender identity, and gender expression, but that biological sex is fixed and something that you're born with, and that despite variations in gender presentation, everyone fits into either female or male, XX or XY. However, as we will discuss in this section of class, scientists have found that biological sex may also be more like a spectrum than we previously thought. Before we get into the readings, let's address the question of why sociologists, whose discipline focuses on the social, would study the body and biology or chromosomes. The answer to this is that anatomy matters. We are going to focus strictly on genitals for this discussion, but our society is organized around anatomy, from what school you can attend, what type of prison you are put into, who you play sports with, who you can fight next to in war, to what bathroom you can use, and so on. Secondly, our society makes up rules based on anatomy, and genitals in particular. So 100 years ago, because of my genitals, I could not vote, could not inherit property. Up until 2015, your genitals determined whether or not you could access the legal rights of marriage in the US. And we're currently having debates about what type of bathroom someone is able to use based on anatomy. But what about people born with anatomies that don't quote unquote fit with the social rules, even if they are statistically rare? Society can try and ignore them until it's forced to change, as you see with the example of the Capitol crawl, in which Americans with disabilities descended on the Capitol without their mobility devices to show that this building is not accessible in order to urge the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So this is an example where society can take these bodies into account and either ignore them, push them to the side, or acknowledge them and make accommodations for them, as they did with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act a few months later, in which discrimination based on physical or mental disability in employment was outlawed and ensured access to buildings and public and private transportation for people with all different types of abilities. So, how does this work when we're thinking about gender and people who fall outside of this male female binary? As we will see with new research and the experiences of intersex people, when people are born with anatomies that don't fit the social rules, they expose the cracks of the anatomical borders that we thought were seamless. So the Ainsworth article details some of the new research that lends support to the idea that there is not as strict a boundary between male and female when talking about biological sex. Ainsworth details some of the studies on cellular sex, which calls into question the common assumption that every cell contains the same set of genes. Research has shown that some sex cells can lose a Y chromosome, and if most cells end up as XY, the result is a person who's physically typically male. But if most cells are X, the result is a female condition called Turner syndrome. Studies on microchimerism also show the ways in which genetically distinct cells from a fetus that contain an XY chromosome, for example, can cross the placenta into the mother's body and vice versa. And third, genetic research on people born with differences in sex development, who have been defined using the umbrella term of intersex, show lots of different examples of which a person born with XX or XY or any combination of those may not have genitalia that develops in the quote-unquote typical male or female fashion. So the article mentions that many people never discover their condition unless they seek help for infertility or discover it through some other brush with medicine. The Ainsworth article includes this chart, which details some of the specific differences in development related to gender and the various configurations of chromosomes, gonads, genitals, and other characteristics. Although we will use the term intersex throughout the rest of this discussion, intersex covers a wide variety of differences in development, and you can click here to see some of the specifics in all of those traits that fall under this intersex umbrella. The Ainsworth article ends by saying that despite the emergence of this research that demonstrates a more nuanced view of sex, society has yet to catch up. And why? What makes embracing sex as a spectrum such a difficult proposition? So, just as the disability activist showed, if we acknowledge that sex is a spectrum, then society and the state will have to grapple with the consequences of how they organized society and made rules for people based on this idea that there is a gender binary. So, as Ainsworth writes, many societies are now comfortable with men and women crossing conventional societal boundaries in their choice of appearance, career, and sexual partner, but when it comes to sex, there is still intense social pressure to conform to the binary model. This pressure has meant that people born with differences in development often undergo surgery to quote unquote normalize their genitals. The Greenfield article explores the history of this practice and how intersex infants are treated in more recent cases. In the late 1960s, psychologist and sexologist John Money claimed that gender was malleable or changeable until 18 months, and that a child could be reassigned any gender with surgical reinforcement. This theory was based on the case of David Reimer, or John Joan as they were called in the literature. Interestingly, despite the impact of Money's work on this case, Reimer wasn't actually born with any intersex traits. He underwent genital normalization surgery following a botched circumcision. Due to the injury, Money argued that his genitals should be made to look more like a vagina and that he should be raised as a girl. However, this theory ended up being a failure as David converted back to living as a man in 1997. Reimer experienced intense trauma from this experience and took his own life in 2004. In addition to emotional side effects of genital surgery, many intersex adults have talked about the physical effects of scarring, reduced sexual sensitivity, torn genital tissue, sterilization, and stenosis. The Greenfield article goes into detail about some of the motivations that doctors and parents have for going through with these surgeries on their infants. In the past, doctors did not fully inform families about this condition because they thought they had an ethical duty to protect them. And I think if we think about the parents who had to make these decisions, we can sympathize with the decision they had to make because, as like Ainsworth says, in most countries, it is legally impossible to be anything but male or female. So when parents think about where their child might fit in society, it makes sense that they may have chosen surgery when there seems like there is no actual place for someone who does not fit easily into male or female. Although infant normalization surgeries are not new, what is unique about this historical time period is that the internet has created the ability for families to learn more about differences in development and for intersex people to connect with one another. Many of the intersex people talk about how they thought they were the only person like this, and now with the rise of social media, intersex people can connect with each other and share their stories to the larger public, and also challenge the ways in which we have historically treated people with differences in development. The Greenfield article describes the case of baby M, which was the first legal challenge to intersex surgeries on infants. The lawsuit argued that baby M's right to due process was violated by the hospital and the South Carolina Department of Social Services by operating on the baby without their consent. The lawsuit was settled and baby M's adoptive family was awarded monetary compensation. This video takes a look at more recent activism around normalization surgeries and the continued debate about their use with intersex patients. As the video details, individual intersex people may want to have surgery, but the argument is for allowing intersex people the chance to decide for themselves. In 2018, the California Senate passed a continuing resolution to publicly oppose unnecessary surgeries on intersex infants. Although this resolution is not binding, meaning it does not outlaw the surgeries, California is the first state to take a public stance on this debate. At the end of this PowerPoint, I included some links on intersex media representations and other resources if you're interested in finding more information about this topic.